Well, for the first time in 15 years, Winnipeg's New Flyer Industries is building transit buses from start to finish completely here in Canada.
We are able to build back and build back strong. And what has happened here is an example of building Canada strong.
What if a single bus could reveal how an entire economic system works? On March 3rd, 2026, something quiet but historic happened in Winnipeg. A bus rolled off an assembly line, and for the first time in modern history, it had been built entirely on Canadian soil. No final stop across the border, no last-minute assembly somewhere else, just a finished vehicle completed where it started. It sounds simple, but that moment ended a pattern that had lasted 15 years. For more than a decade, buses built in Canada had to cross into the United States to be finished. Not because Canada lacked factories, engineers, or skilled workers. The reason was a rule that quietly controlled the entire industry. The regulation is known as the Buy America Act, and for years, that law determined where the most valuable work happened. To understand why this matters, you need to look at the company behind the story. The manufacturer is NFI Group, the largest heavy-duty bus producer in North America. Its headquarters sit in Winnipeg, and its vehicles operate in dozens of cities across the continent. For decades, the company built strong steel frames and major structural parts in Canada. Workers in Winnipeg handled the tough manufacturing work, cutting steel, welding structures, and building the skeleton of each bus. But once those frames were ready, something unusual happened. Instead of being finished in Canada, the buses were loaded onto trucks and sent across the border. Why? Because under the Buy America rules, if a transit agency in the United States wanted federal funding for buses, the final assembly had to happen inside the country. That meant companies like NFI had only two choices. Either move their final assembly operations into the United States or lose access to the largest transit market in North America. For 15 years, the company followed that system. And that's where the strange paradox began. Because even though Canada owned the factory, the engineers and the workforce producing the buses, the most valuable part of production was happening somewhere else. But eventually, something changed, and that change started with rising trade pressure. And what happened next forced Canada to rethink the entire system. For years, the arrangement seemed normal. Winnipeg workers produced the frames and early components. Those unfinished buses were then transported south, where American facilities completed the final assembly. The system worked, but it created a hidden imbalance. Final assembly is where the highest value manufacturing work usually happens. It involves installing electrical systems, interiors, drivetrains, testing equipment, and integrating all the technology that makes the vehicle operational. These jobs require specialized technicians and skilled engineers, and they also generate higher wages and stronger economic activity. So every time a bus crossed the border unfinished, a portion of the economic value traveled with it. Canadian workers handled the heavy manufacturing at the beginning of the process, but the final stage, the most profitable stage, happened somewhere else. For more than 15 years, that structure remained unchanged. But in 2025, the political and economic environment began shifting. Trade tensions between Canada and the United States started rising again. Tariffs and policy disputes created new uncertainty across several industries. Suddenly, governments had to ask difficult questions about long-term economic security. For Canadian policymakers, one question stood out. What happens if a country depends too heavily on another nation for critical parts of its manufacturing system? For decades, the North American economy had operated with deeply integrated supply chains. Components were built in one country, shipped to another, and assembled somewhere else. But trade disputes exposed how fragile that system could be. If political tensions increased or regulations changed, entire industries could be affected almost overnight. That realization forced leaders in Ottawa to start thinking differently. Instead of asking how Canada could sell more products to the United States, policymakers began asking a more strategic question. What would it take to build the entire product at home? That idea led to a plan that would eventually reshape the Winnipeg factory. And surprisingly, the investment required wasn't enormous, but its impact would be significant. The plan to bring full bus assembly back to Winnipeg started with a targeted investment. The total funding came to $38 million. About $23.4 million came from the Manitoba provincial government. The remaining funds were shared between the Canadian federal government and NFI Group itself. Compared to large aerospace projects or defense programs, that amount might seem modest. But what it created was something Canada had not built before, a complete bus, an assembly operation capable of finishing vehicles entirely inside the country. The new facility added roughly 250 direct manufacturing jobs, increasing the company's workforce in Manitoba to around 3,000 employees. And within its first week of operation, the new assembly line began producing vehicles. 20 buses moved through the plant. 5 of them were fully completed in Canada. The other 15 still followed the older production system and continued traveling south for final assembly. At first glance, 5 buses might not sound revolutionary, But those 5 vehicles represented the first modern transit buses in Canadian, history to be finished entirely on Canadian soil. And they marked the beginning of a much larger plan. By the year 2027, the company aims to produce approximately 240 fully completed buses every year, running multiple assembly lines simultaneously. But the Winnipeg project wasn't just about one factory expanding production. Canadian officials began describing it as something bigger, a model. The idea was simple. If Canada could rebuild final assembly in the transit industry, the same strategy could apply to other sectors. Industries like steel, electronics, and pharmaceuticals all depend on international supply chains, where key stages of production often happen outside the country. The Winnipeg project suggested a different path, one where governments and companies cooperate to strengthen domestic manufacturing capacity. But while policymakers talked about strategy, the people inside Winnipeg were focused on something far more personal, their jobs. And their reaction to the new factory wasn't what many expected. Manufacturing communities often live through cycles of expansion and decline. Factories grow, then shrink. Jobs appear, then disappear. Because of that history, workers in Winnipeg reacted cautiously when the new assembly line was first announced. They had heard promises before. Sometimes investments meant automation replacing workers instead of hiring them. So the early response wasn't excitement, it was careful skepticism. But this time, the outcome looked different. The new positions were skilled manufacturing, roles on the assembly floor, jobs that require training, technical experience, and long-term career development. These kinds of roles do more than support one factory. They strengthen an entire industrial ecosystem. Economists call this the multiplier effect. When a major manufacturing facility expands, suppliers begin producing more materials. Logistics companies handle additional shipments. Engineering firms and technical specialists become part of the supply chain. One factory can influence dozens of other businesses. And that's why analysts believe the Winnipeg project could have broader economic impact over time. However, Canada still faces limitations. Even though the buses are now assembled domestically, some critical components still come from outside the country. Engines are the most obvious example. Canada does not yet have a major domestic supplier producing transit bus engines at scale. So the system is not fully independent. Not yet. But the difference between not yet and never tried is enormous. For 15 years, the final step of bus production happened somewhere else. Now that step exists in Winnipeg. And sometimes, major economic changes don't begin with dramatic announcements. They begin quietly with a new production, a line starting up and a finished vehicle rolling forward for the first time. A single bus might not seem like much, but sometimes one bus is enough to show that the system has finally started to change.